Все, можемо починати. Welcome, everybody. I will be the host today, and most welcome to Barbarara Oklі, professor of engineering at Oklend University and worldwide known author of many books. Two of them is here, and I personally adore the translation of one of them, "Уроки без мороки," which is in English is "Learning like a Pro." Yeah, and Barbara will give us the lecture for approximately an hour and 15 minutes, yeah? And then we will have a Q&A session. And we have time till 5 p.m., yeah? Yeah, okay. So the slides are ready, yeah? Yeah, and the floor is yours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I am so happy and so honored to be here. Ukraine is my favorite country in the whole world. And so let's go ahead and dive in because I have so much I want to share. So let's start. I am going to cover a little bit about generative AI here. Now, for those of you who might have been in yesterday's session, you'll see some of the same information, but also some new information. So be aware. But Fei-Fei Li said, that AI will not replace humans, but humans who know how to use AI will replace those who don't. And I think that's especially in Ukraine, where you need that human power, that manpower, this can extend your capabilities beautifully. But I would like to say, so just a little bit about me. I am from Oklend University, and sometimes people think, oh, Oakland, California, palm trees. No, I am from Oakland University in Michigan, which is snowy and cold in the winter, and that's me digging out in February. And I teach this course called Learning How to Learn with Terry Sinowski, who's the Francis Crick Professor at the Salk Institute. And this is Terry going to work on a typical February day because he does live in Southern California. I'm jealous of him for having this wonderful weather all year long. But the thing is, I was, to my shock, invited to speak at Harvard. I was a nervous wreck. I mean, imagine if you were invited to speak at Harvard. You'd probably be nervous too. I walked into the room, though, and I became even more nervous because it was packed, standing room only, all around the edges. And I wondered, why are there so many people here? It turns out our one little course made for virtually nothing, mostly in my basement, this is my basement, had on the order of the same number of students as all of Harvard's massive online courses and online courses put together, made for millions of dollars with hundreds of people. And what this tells you is that people around the world are really interested in new, innovative, practically useful information about how you can learn effectively. So I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about ChatGPT, because as you will see, that will help us understand some of the learning tricks that we will naturally need to use in our own lives. Now, ChatGPT, some of you may know that it works by predicting the next word in a sentence. That's kind of how it's trained. But of course, it does a lot more than that. It's relating words to one another using word vectors, large numbers that allow us to see the relationships between words in a sentence, and also, even more than a sentence, in great swaths of the internet. But I'm going to anthropomorphize in this lecture. That means, the word anthropomorphize means talking about something as if it was a human being when it's actually not a human being. And I'm going to talk about computers and generative AI as if it were a human, even though it's not, because it's going to make things so much easier on us if I do speak that way. So if you'll remember, about 5 years ago, if you went to Google Translate, it would do an awful job of translating things. And the reason for that was, by the time the computer got to the end of the sentence, it forgot what was at the beginning of a sentence. So it was really hard to, do good translations that way. But now, of course, it can relate not only sentences, but essays and large sections of material throughout the web. And the thing is, how does it do that? If I'm going to give you like a 2-minute overview of the history of generative AI. And in 2017, a paper was published in a conference called the Neural Information Processing Society conference. And my colleague, Terry Sinowski, my co-instructor, he is the president of this society. And he told me, when they submitted this paper, we just thought it was nothing. We didn't think it was important at all. We relegated it off to a corner, and it was a poster session given by a graduate student. Well, nobody thought it was a very big deal at all. But it turns out this paper is so important, it has been cited over 100,000 times. And the reason for that is that it introduced the idea of the transformer. Now, what the transformer does, one thing that we do as humans is we often say, we're the only ones that can be creative. It kind of reminds me of how people used to think about humans like 1,000 years ago. The sun rotates around the earth because we are the center of the universe. We're not the center of the universe, and we are not the only ones who can be creative. So let's see, do we have sound, I hope, in our lecture? I guess we'll find out if we have sound, he's asking. Do we have sound? Yes? No?
Можна включати? Давай.
We have sound? Okay. We have sound. It's always a mystery. Will we have sound or not? So who here knows of the website called Suno? Okay, a few of you. This is a website that will create music. And what I did was I went to Suno and I entered in the title of the paper, Attention is All You Need, and then I put in a few sentences about really boring characteristics of transformers. And then this is hopefully what it produced. So you can see that it's so funny. My brother is a musician, and I played this song for him. He was like, oh, it's really bad. But it's because he knew it was generative AI. If he hadn't known, he would have said, that's a pretty catchy tune. And this is a way of creating. Do you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a husband or wife you want to impress? All you have to do, enter their name, enter a few really nice characteristics about them, have it write a song for you, present it as a gift to the one you're trying to impress, and they will think you are really creative. And you are. You are creative and you are co-creative because you're using some of that creative ability of generative AI. Now, let's just take a little bit of a peek under the hood of generative AI and see what it's doing. It has, your basic generative AI runs off of that transformer, and it has two parts. It has the encoder that we feed that prompt into, and if you look here, this little part here that says positional encoding looks really innocuous, like it's not very important. That's actually the magic right there that applies that big, big number that allows us to relate all the words. But you feed your prompt into the encoder, and then out of the decoder comes whatever information it's giving back as a result of our prompt. But, that's all interesting. But what we're really interested in here is the flow of information through transformers is remarkably similar to the flow of information through the human brain. And this is no surprise because actually neuroscientists and experts in artificial intelligence have worked hand in hand through the decades to inform one another. So, as we'll see later, a lot of what's going on with large language models like ChatGPT is actually simply quite similar to how our brain is working. But this means that if we just know a little more about how the brain works, we can use generative AI more effectively and also learn more effectively. So what's going on with the human brain? We know that it's very complicated, but if we want to, we can just focus in on the fundamental building block of the brain, and that is the neuron. There's about 86 billion neurons in the brain, and I wish you could see your faces right now. You're like, oh, this is where she's going to get to the super boring scientific part, so let's spice it up a little bit. Let's use a metaphor for a neuron to better understand what a neuron is doing. And the metaphor we're going to use is a space alien. So if you look here, we've got our space alien, and it's got these legs, 3 legs. Those are analogous to dendrites on a real neuron. And then there's these little toes. I mean, it's a space alien. It can have lots of toes. And so those are analogous to what are called dendritic spines. And then it has an arm that reaches upwards. That's called an axon. And what neurons like to do is they like to reach out with those little arms and tickle the toe of an adjoining neuron. What this really means is that neurons they're reaching out and they're sending a signal. That signal is mostly electrical, but it jumps that gap with neurotransmitters and goes to the next neuron. And what is happening when you are learning anything is you are creating a clump of connected neurons. They're connected through those signals that are going between the neurons. And this is what happens whenever you learn something. So you are creating, as you're learning, you're creating a clump of connected neurons in long-term memory. And unfortunately, psychologists and educators for the last, several decades have said, you don't need to remember things, you can always look things up. But would I speak Ukrainian if I just went to Google Translate? Of course not. I need to have those links in my own long-term memory if I am to remember and become an expert with anything. So how do we build the connections between these neurons? How do we strengthen them? Well, practice helps to strengthen those connections. And what happens if we don't practice? Like, I had a student who was taking a statistics test that I was giving, and he flunked it. He did very badly. He comes marching up to me, he waves this test, and he says, how could I have flunked this test? I understood it when you said it in class. But it didn't matter if he understood it when I said it in class, because he needed to remember what he was understanding. He needed to build those links. What he had done was something like this. He had maybe kind of understood what I was saying in class, but then he didn't practice with it. He didn't make sure it was in his memory, and as a result, his little synaptic janitor just swept those dendritic spines away. So this is why it's important to practice with the material. Not only pull it from your mind, but do it over a number of days. So everyone, as it turns out, has sort of a differing bath of neurochemicals in their brain. And what this means from our perspective, so this is one of my dendrites, the leg of that neuron. And so our little granddaughter she's bilingual in that she speaks Spanish, which is her daddy's language from Chile, and English, of course, from mommy, our daughter. And so I want to speak Spanish. So I practice in the mornings with my Spanish vocabulary list. And I practice and I make connections, and then guess what happens by night? Like, I look at the list, I've forgotten half the words. I have to practice again with those. And look at what happens when I practice again. Do you notice how the old configuration is that faint set of links. The new configuration is slightly different. So I have to practice. It's a little different. Now, there are some people who have an extraordinary memory. And what they do is they memorize a vocabulary list, and by night, maybe they lose a tiny bit. They can easily refresh. These are really fast learners. I would love to be a fast learner like that. Maybe. Because here's what the difference is. Someone like me, I learn much more slowly. But at the same time, what it means is the fast learner, they're fast, but they can jump to conclusions, think they've got it, and look, all their memory, those dendritic spines stay there. And they're not flexible. Like, if they're wrong with their first guess, they can't change. Have you ever met someone like a manager or someone high level, and they're really smart, but they're completely inflexible? They just won't listen to anybody with different ideas than theirs. And that can be part of what's going on. So for someone like me, on the other hand, I'm really slow, right? I'm slow, but I can, because I'm not jumping to conclusions, I can be more accurate with what I'm learning. And also, if I'm wrong, I can say, oh, I was wrong, and I can change my mind. So if you are a slow learner, my hero in science is a man named Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was a terrible learner growing up in Spain in the 1860s. He had clear symptoms of attention deficit disorder and dyslexia. And, very slow with how he learned. But so do not try this at home. His father was a doctor, and he's like at his wit's end. How do I get my son to get interested in anything? So we took his son out to a cemetery, and they dug up some bodies, and they examined anatomy by looking at the bodies they dug up at the cemetery. Santiago Ramon y Cajal was fascinated, and he decided he wanted to become a doctor. So here this terrible student, is attracted for nefarious reasons to wanting to become a doctor, and he did. He became a doctor, and then he decided to apply to become a professor. Took the test 1 year, flunked. Took the test the second year, flunked. Took the test the last year he could apply, passed it. He became a professor of anatomy, but that wasn't enough for this really slow and bad learner. Because of his research, he went on to win the Nobel Prize. But that wasn't enough. He went on after that and now is known as the father of modern neuroscience. And he was asked, well, what was your special magic that somebody that was as awful a learner as you could actually be so successful? And he said, number one, I was persistent. I really kept trying to learn. But number two, I was flexible. When the data showed me I was wrong, I could change my mind about things. So if you are a slow learner here, guess what? You can sometimes do things even geniuses cannot. So it can be a very good attribute. Now, so we have race car learners who are really fast. We've got hiker learners like me, except I don't look quite like that. But if you think about it, race car learners, they can get to the finish line really fast, but everything goes by in a blur. A hiker, much slower to get to the finish line, but they can reach out, touch the leaves on the trees, smell the pine in the air, completely different experience, and in some ways, far richer and deeper. So I want to back up a little bit at this point, just give you a little insight into how I grew up. I grew up moving all over the United States. By the time I was about 15 years old, I'd lived in 10 different places. And the thing is, mathematics is very sequential. If you fall off anywhere along the way, it can be hard to get back on. Well, you know well here in Ukraine how easy it is to disrupt education because of something that's happened. So for me, my education in math was disrupted when I moved from Texas to Massachusetts when I was only 7 years old. They were suddenly far ahead of me in the multiplication tables. Here's my little secret. I didn't like math anyway. And, I just thought, why? What's the point? Why should I don't even like it. So I flunked my way through elementary, middle, and high school math and science, which is kind of ironic since I am speaking with you here today as a distinguished professor of engineering. And I'm the real deal. I mean, I publish in top journals and so forth. And I think this tells you that if you do make a subtle tweak in how you're thinking about yourself and what you can do far more than you might ever believe. Now, one day, though, one of my students asked me, my engineering students, he said, he heard about my sordid past as a math flunky, and he asked me, how did you change your brain? And I thought about it, and I was this little girl. I like that picture because it is the last cute picture of me. But I loved animals and knitting and weaving and things like that. I knew I could never grow up and do anything technical, or so I thought. And so I decided, okay, so if you know the answer to this, don't say, because a few people were at my talk yesterday. But what do you call a person who speaks two languages? Bilingual. A person who speaks one language? An American, yes. So I was a typical American, and I only spoke one language, and I thought, I want to learn a second language. And I couldn't afford to go to college and study it, but I found out there was one way to learn another language and actually get paid for it. So at that time, I had the choice of many different languages. I made a mistake. I learned Russian instead of Ukrainian by enlisting in the army. And this is me looking super nervous, about to throw a hand grenade. And if you knew how clumsy I am, you would know why I look so nervous. But I learned Russian, and I ended up working for the Soviets, which is why I so appreciate the lives that you are working towards with freedom now. And I ended up working on Soviet trawlers up in the Bering Sea. So I loved new adventures and new perspectives. So I also ended up at the South Pole Station in Antarctica, and that is where I met my husband. And that was 40 years ago. I am the luckiest woman on earth. He's behind every successful woman, I think, at least in my case. There's a wonderful, wonderful man. And I'm going to tell you a little secret about how we differ. So when our daughters, parents among you, you will sort of empathize with this. You know how children will go up to you and ask for money? Well, our daughters, whenever they need money, they go to me. I'm a soft touch, But when they need emotional support, they go to my husband. And the reason for that is my husband, he can listen, he can sympathize, but he doesn't get down into the pit of misery with them. He helps lift them up by sympathizing, but not empathizing and feeling the same feelings. And that is a wonderful way to help people, and that is one of his great gifts. Sympathize, but don't feel that you have to feel the same feelings that someone else is feeling, especially if they're really depressed or had some bad things, because it doesn't help them as much as if you help lift them back into your world. So what happened was I was, I was going to get out of the Army. I was 28 years old, or 26 years old, and all of my friends were West Point engineers. They were able to get jobs super easily, but no one wanted someone with my skill set, which was the ability to speak Russian, understandably. And so I thought, wait a minute, now aren't I supposed to be open to new adventures and new perspectives? Why don't I see if I can have a new perspective of my mind and do what seemed like the most alien thing possible for me, which was become an electrical engineer. So at age 26, I went to the university, started at the lowest possible level of remedial high school algebra, and slowly began climbing my way upwards. It was not easy, but if I'd known then what I know now about how to learn effectively, I could have made it much easier on myself. And that is part of why I am here in Ukraine today, is to share some of these insights from neuroscience about how to learn effectively to help you jump and learn more easily without that struggle and wasted time. So let us begin with the first error that I made when I was 7 years old. I thought, okay, I can't figure this problem out. Everyone else in the class knows how to do it. I must be stupid. And I gave up. But what I didn't know was this. There are two different modes that the brain uses when we're interacting with the world. Think about it this way. Let's say, think about a bird. How could a bird survive from an evolutionary perspective to, pass on its genes and go along to the next generation? It has two major problems. The first problem is it has to be able to peck the food, right? But the second is it has to be able to look widely and see if a predator is going to attack. So pecking or wide. And it's thought that that is perhaps why there's two different hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere often is involved in focused activities. The right hemisphere is involved in more broad, diffuse kinds of activities. So that focusing is focus mode. It's also called by psychologists the task positive network. And there's another mode, which is that more broad, diffuse, we call it daydreaming or mind wandering. Often, our mind will go back and forth between focusing and more broadly, aware of the surroundings. So to better understand these two different modes, what will we use? Anybody know? I used a metaphor to help explain neurons, right? We use that the space alien, and we will similarly use a metaphor to help us understand these two different modes. The metaphor we're going to use is that of a pinball machine. So if you think about it, if you're my age, you remember pinball machines. But if you're not, then all you had to do to play pinball is pull back on that plunger, a ball goes bouncing around on the rubber bumpers, that's how you get points. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that pinball machine right on the human brain. Are you ready for it? Okay, here goes. Okay, there is the pinball machine on the brain. Now, this is, let's say that you are solving like I asked you to multiply 23 times 47. Some of you could actually do it in your head. Some would just get out a piece of paper. And you kind of take your thinking and you move along the patterns that you've already laid because you've already learned how to multiply. But how, so that's, that black line there is kind of like that linked set of neurons that you're using because you've already laid that pathway. But what happens when you're learning something completely new and you don't have that pathway anymore. So in this case, let's say you know multiplication, but you don't know division. So what can happen is you're trying to lay the links of division, but your thoughts can keep slithering back up to multiplication because it's simple, it's easy. You already know how to do it, and it feels lots easier and nicer to use some of those patterns, but that means you cannot solve the problem. So let's say you're trying to work that first division problem. Your teacher had explained it to you that day, but you find you can't get the right answer. You just don't understand what's going on. You get more and more and more frustrated. That's what was happening with me at 7 years old. I was getting more and more frustrated, and I thought, oh, I'm just dumb. That's why I, can't solve this problem. What I needed to do was to back away and get my attention off it, a few minutes, a few hours, maybe overnight. And what happens when I take my attention off that subject that I was stuck on? It allows this diffuse mode, which neuroscientists call the default mode network, to allow the thoughts to bounce around in the background while I'm not even conscious of it. And then, when I later return to the focus mode, somehow it's all easy. In fact, learning, have you noticed that yourself? You walk away from something you're stuck on, you let it percolate a little bit, and then when you go back to it, it seems so simple that you wonder why you ever struggled with it. So learning often involves going back and forth between focused and diffuse mode. You can't be in both modes at the same time on the same topic unless you are taking certain forms of mushrooms. And I am not advocating this here, even though I think mushrooms in Ukraine are really quite delicious. So, but in any case, so this is something very important, and yet, can you believe that most students around the world can go for 8 to 18 years of education and never have a course on how to learn effectively, how their brain works? That's amazing to me. I mean, I do believe that in 50 years, especially here in Ukraine, because you are visionary and forward-looking, that people will be looking back and say that prehistoric time when they didn't even teach students how to learn effectively. And these ideas that I'm sharing here now are something we can easily teach children. So when they reach that, that step of frustration, they know to back away and take it a little easier. But even more important than learning about focused and diffuse modes and making connections in long-term memory is the idea of procrastination. And, okay, who here has not procrastinated? Not procrastinated? I mean, we've all procrastinated. And because when you're working on something, you're not working on other things. And in fact, procrastination is a huge issue in education because, you can put something off until the last minute, and then it's really a stressful time to be learning because you don't have the time. Why do we procrastinate? As it turns out, when you even just think about something you don't like or don't want to do, it activates the insular cortex, which experiences pain. And so, the brain naturally enough, here's what you do. You think about something you don't like or don't want to do, like for me, taxes. In the US, I do not like doing my taxes. I think about it, and my brain goes, oh, let's look at something else. And I feel happier almost immediately. I do this once or twice, no big deal. I do it very often, and it can have severe long-term consequences in my life. So I'm an engineer. That means I'm very practical now, and I'm just going to give you what is a good solution for procrastination. It is the Pomodoro technique. And this was invented by an Italian in the 1980s. I have gotten thousands of emails from people who've taken Learning How to Learn, learned about the Pomodoro technique, and found that it changed their lives. And it's so simple. All you have to do is first turn off all distractions, which means no little ringy-dingies on your cell phone, nothing popping up on your computer, and then you set a timer for 25 minutes, focus as intently as you can, but only for those 25 minutes, and then give yourself 5 minutes of relaxation where you do not pick up your cell phone. You remember how I talked about that diffuse mode and you need a little time? This Pomodoro technique allows you to use focus mode, and then when you relax, just like make a cup of tea or look out the window or walk around a little bit, but not focusing on your cell phone, you can activate that default mode network, and it will help you kind of strengthen those neural connections you've been making as you were first learning. So Pomodoro technique is incredibly useful. We know from neuroscience that it prevents you from multitasking and allows you to really kind of focus, but it's a good time period, that 25 minutes. It's like not so long. I mean, anybody can do 25 minutes. But sometimes what people will do is they'll do 4, Pomodoros, and then after the last Pomodoro, they might do a half an hour break, something like that. So the Pomodoro is a really handy technique, and but what I want to do now, no, wait. Okay, what I want you to do now is I want you to take a little break. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and hopefully a neighbor who you don't know. Introduce yourself, and then ask each other, what is focus mode? What's an example of focus mode? What is an example of diffuse mode? You have 3 minutes. On your mark, get set, turn to your neighbor who you don't know, go. Does it make sense? Okay. If you can hear me, raise your hand. If you can hear me, raise your hand. If you can really hear me, raise both hands. Okay. Isn't this amazing? Like you talk to one another and it gets so exciting that it's hard to stop. And so what did we just do here? You know, we talked about focused and diffuse modes. You might wonder, how long do you have to be in that diffuse mode? When you turn to your neighbor, even those few seconds of, did you feel a little bit when I said, okay, now I want you to turn to your neighbor. Did you feel it go, oh, I can take a little break from all this focusing on the stage? That little break where you were turning and talking to someone else, but it was much more relaxed, you momentarily went into that diffuse mode. So this is why when you're teaching, sometimes little breaks like this where people can turn to one another, kind of think out loud to one another, and also be reflecting to themselves, can be a very useful activity for students to kind of pick up what's actually going on. You don't have to do a lot of these breaks, but even just one or two kind of sprinkled through your course can really help. So I want to talk now about working memory, long-term memory, and octopuses, because they're obviously all related to one another. So working memory, I love talking to audiences that speak more than, where most people speak more than one language. Because working memory, it's in the prefrontal cortex. And let's say you are translating a sentence from one language to another language. What you're doing is you're holding it in your working memory. It's that temporary little storage place where you're working with the information. So working memory is completely different than long-term memory. So long-term memory is a little bit like a set of lockers that's scattered actually all over the brain. And in those lockers are sets of neural links, just like what was created earlier, or what we talked about earlier. Now, working memory is typically thought of, it's like an octopus, but with only 4 arms. You might call it a quadrupus instead of an octopus. That means it can hold 4 pieces of information. It's very limited how much you can take in with working memory. But when I'm speaking with you, your working memory is taking in the information, and here's what it's doing. It's creating weak sets of neural links. Those links are being stored in long-term memory, and if you practice with them, later it can be easy to reach back into your memory and pull them to mind. So this brings me to my younger daughter, Rachel. Sometimes people will ask me, how did you make an online course for virtually nothing, mostly in your basement? Well, the way to do a really cheap course is to get your children to be doing a lot of the acting needs for whatever course you're filming, right? Children will work really cheaply. They'll work for food, right? So I asked my younger daughter, Rachel, to model for us what it had felt like when she had recently learned to back up a car. So watch Rachel's little face as she's backing up the car. She's like, this is when she's first learning. She's like, should I look in the front mirror, the back mirror, or do I look before me or back, and then off she goes into the ditch. And what was happening was when Rachel was learning to back up the car, the first learning, she had what's called a heavy cognitive load. That meant all the arms of that octopus were really busy as she was trying to figure things out, and she had no arms available for anything else. But once Rachel learned to back up the car, all she had to do was think, I want to back up the car. She pulls that set of links to mind, and she has a light cognitive load, which means she's got, arms free on that octopus, so she can think about other things like, what's playing on the radio, or, is my seatbelt fastened? And so she's got working memory available for other things. So a key idea is creating those links in long-term memory about key, for example, when you're learning a language, when you've got those key vocabulary words and grammatical structures in your long-term memory, you can easily pull them to mind. And what teachers want is that when you're taking a test, your working memory kind of hops up there, and it says, oh, I pulled this set of links out from this, and I connect these links together, and this helps solve the maybe rather new problem that they see on the test. But what can sometimes happen is if students have not practiced and ensured those links are in long-term memory, they sit down to the test, and that's when they first realize that, oh, wait a minute, I don't have any memory of this. And they will sometimes come to the instructor and say, I really knew the material better than it shows on the test, but actually they're fooling themselves. And the reason for it is because we're not teaching them how to learn effectively. I kid you not, I can look at some material on a page, and I am convinced I have it in my long-term memory, but it's only in my working memory. You can't tell the difference when you're looking at it. Only when you look away, or like for me, I might say, I know I've got it in long-term memory. Then I ask myself the next day, what was it? I can't remember. So there are tricks and techniques to ensure that something is truly in your long-term memory. But I do want to say something, and that is, we know we have 4 arms on our working memory octopus. But guess what? Generative AI has like thousands of arms. So what that means is we want to join that AI revolution because it can help us co-create very effectively. Now, I had talked about how important it is to create those sets of neural links in long-term memory, but I want to give you a little sense of what you can do with information you already know. Now, if a lot of times, let's say you know one concept. If you think about a metaphor related to the concept you already know for a new concept, you can learn the new concept more easily. What do I mean by that? Like, let's say you know about how the current of water flow, how water flows. It seems so simple now. But when you were a baby, a toddler, you would play with water. It took you a long time to figure out, how does water flow? Well, once you've got that concept of how water flows, you can more easily use that concept to understand how electrical current flows. So using a metaphor when you are trying to learn something, or if you're trying to teach something, can be invaluable in helping you learn or teach effectively. Now, when I was working on the book Mind for Numbers, I found out the names of thousands and thousands of the top teachers in English of subjects like engineering, mathematics, economics, psychology, you name it. And I wrote to thousands of these top teachers, top professors who were well known for their teaching ability, and I asked them to look at the manuscript for this book. And shocking percentages of them told me, sure, I'll take a look. And they give me great insights, so I wish I could take credit for how well that book turned out, but I have to hand it to my many, many different collaborators. But they often came back when they emailed me with one extra insight. They would say, this is really good, here's some things to fix, and so forth. They say, I do this one little thing, though, actually, and that is the magic that makes people say, I'm such a good instructor. And I don't usually tell other people what this magic was. I don't tell the other teachers. And what was that magic? It was the use of metaphor and analogy. And they didn't tell other teachers about it, not because they were trying to hide it, but because the other professors would say, oh, so that's why you're such a popular teacher. You just make it so easy for the students. But isn't that the job of teachers? To help make things easier on students? So using a metaphor can be a powerful tool when you're trying to learn or teach anything. Metaphors always break down. I mean, if you're using water current as a metaphor for electrical current flow at a quantum level, that doesn't work. But when it breaks down, you just throw it away and get a new metaphor. Where do you get metaphors? Guess what? ChatGPT. It is the best. It's so fun. Let's say that you are teaching Python programming. Sounds maybe boring, right? But if you ask for a metaphor for main guard and scope in Python programming, what you'll get is a wonderful, image from ChatGPT where it says main guard can be thought of as the gatekeeper for a castle, and scope are like the rooms within a castle. If you go in and you're asking for metaphors, don't just ask for one. Ask for a lot, ask for 5 different metaphors. Tell it a little bit about you, and it will help create something that really sings to you in a metaphorical language that you understand. Marketing teams, they used to spend weeks coming up with just the right metaphor to quickly convey an idea within, about a pharmaceutical that they only had 30 seconds to advertise on television. We don't need to have whole marketing teams working for weeks. We can just ask ChatGPT and it can come up with these wonderful metaphors. So since we're using metaphors, I want you to think about large language models like ChatGPT as being similar to car engines. So if you learn how to drive one car that has one kind of engine in it, you get into another car, you can still drive that car. So you learn to use ChatGPT. If you go to Claude, it's still got pretty much the same driving characteristics. If you go to Gemini, Pi, whatever, it's still got those same driving characteristics. But there are a few handling differences, so to speak. So Greg Brockman, for example, he was formerly the the president of OpenAI, and he famously took a picture of his notebook. In the notebook, it says, "My joke website, really dumb joke 1, push to reveal punchline," and the same for joke 2. So that was in his notebook. He took a picture of it, put it onto ChatGPT, and it created all the code he needed for a joke website. So I took a picture of Brockman's picture, and I put it on ChatGPT, and it created all the code for a joke website. So then I took that same picture, and I loaded it onto Claude, which is developed by Anthropic. It's another large language model. And I asked it to give me the code for a joke website. Claude got back to me, and Claude said, "A joke website? That could hurt people. I'm not going to create a joke website." And I had to argue with Claude to get Claude to finally produce, what, do you want a humorless world? So it finally produced it. So there are differences in how they're tuned, how they're trained. And what I often find, for example, is I like Claude to summarize and give me the essence of research documents. It will help me craft good, careful emails. But ChatGPT will give me more up-to-date and factual information. So I bounce back and forth between them. Gemini, I'm using some, but it's getting better. It used to be not very helpful at all, but now they're all models. The worst they will ever be is today. Tomorrow, the models will be better. By next week, next month, next year, we don't even know where they're going to go, but it's going to be better. I will say that. So let's get a little sense of what's going on worldwide in large language models. So we have in the West, it's no surprise that very large companies have the money to build Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, and Llama. And so pretty much the major companies in the West are affiliated in some fashion with some of the most popular of the large language models. Now, I just don't want you to forget, in China, there's also a whole, there's 3 big giants. And I don't speak Chinese, so, and most of us don't. But you just want to be aware that there's a whole other world of large language models they're doing very sophisticated work. Also, from Europe, there's a French website or a French large language model called Mistral that is coming out and quite competitive with some of these other top large language models. How did the French suddenly come up with this? Turns out that the 2 French engineers that founded this company were at Google DeepMind. So somehow it's like Google has this seeding process. So I think a good idea to send some Ukrainian engineers to be working for Google and bring back some of these insights. But I also want to make you aware of something called the token limit, which is related to something called the context window. That's just how much information can you stuff into a large language model. So I'll give you an example of how that was relevant for my work. So I wrote the book on common sense teaching with my co-authors, and the Japanese publisher of this book reached out to me and said, "I would like you to write the foreword for the Japanese edition of this book." I don't know anything about the Japanese educational system, so what could I do? So at that time, Gemini wasn't out. So Claude was out, and look, it has a limit of around 200,000 tokens. A token is like 3/4 of a word, unless you're speaking Chinese, in which case it's about a word. And so that means I could load a document that had maybe 150,000 words onto it. Of course, that wouldn't give any room for response. So as it turns out, this is maybe with all the extra things, it's about 100,000 words in this document. So I loaded it onto Claude, a PDF, and I asked Claude, how does my book, how does this PDF like highlight and explain from a neuroscientific perspective standard things that are techniques that are used in the Japanese educational system. And then I asked, can you also tell me how this book brings new insights to Japan that have not previously been taught about? And it gave me all this great information back, and I wrote up the foreword. I checked it with some Japanese-speaking friends. I sent it off to the Japanese publisher, and the Japanese publisher was like, oh, how do you know so much about the Japanese educational system? And I was like, you know, I'm just good, yeah. But actually, I was good because I wasn't creating, I was co-creating with the great insights that we can get. Remember that huge working memory capacity. So it's, this can be extremely useful for you in many things you are doing. And I want to give you a little insight into what this means, though, if we're comparing these large language models with the human brain. If you think about it, so remember how I had said that we create links in long-term memory when we're learning anything. But I didn't tell you that there's 2 different pathways that can be used to create those links. And you might say, well, who cares as long as we got links? But the different pathways have different characteristics. So you take information into your working memory, and one pathway goes through the hippocampus into long-term memory. The other pathway is for habits. It's like, and also where you learn your native language, it goes through the basal ganglia. If we look at, we need both types of links, but they do different things. And if we look from a slightly different perspective, that blue box is the hippocampal declarative pathway. The orange box is that automatic basal ganglia pathway. And when you are trying to work like a math problem, something where you're conscious of what you're learning, it goes through the hippocampus, you're conscious of your thinking, and you can solve a problem or understand a new concept. You're conscious of it. But there's a very different way that we learn, as I mentioned. So let's say I'm trying to kick a soccer ball. I'm trying to learn to kick that soccer ball. When I first kick it, here's what happens. I'm not conscious. I say to my basal ganglia, that's really what I'm doing, kick the soccer ball. The basal ganglia does something, and then I see whether I kick the soccer ball in the right direction. I do that again and again, and I learn to kick the soccer ball, but I am never conscious of the magic that is occurring in that basal ganglia learning system. What's inside this unconscious learning system? It turns out it is a deep neural network. What does that mean? Look at all those little circles. Those are like neurons. And the lines are like that axon, a dendritic spine, and a dendrite that connects it to the next layer of neurons. So you have inside your basal ganglia, actually in other places as well, but it's really well understood, better understood in the basal ganglia. When you're learning how to kick that soccer ball, you are kind of doing like this kind of thing. You practice one time, you practice again, you practice again, you get stronger sets of links, you weaken other sets of links. You're learning how to kick that soccer ball. Each time, you're getting a value function. In other words, were you successful with your kick? Were you not successful with the kick? So you're learning through this large language model, and that is remarkably similar to how large language models like ChatGPT are trained. They're not conscious, but we are tuning them with these parameters that are sometimes strengthened, sometimes weakened, as it's learning to predict the outcome of sentences. Now, in humans then, we've got this unconscious basal ganglia system, and we've got this conscious hippocampal system. Interestingly, children have stronger basal ganglia systems. They're really like tuned up, they're strong. And that's how you learn your native language. As you mature, this kind of slumps down some. It's still there, but this ramps up. And that's why when you're an adult, it's really harder to learn to speak another language, because that is, that basal ganglia system isn't as powerful as when you were young. So what happens in humans when you lose that hippocampal ability to learn or to think about things? That happens in people with Alzheimer's. So an Alzheimer's, a person will confabulate, they'll hallucinate, they'll make things up. They don't have that conscious hippocampal system because the disease is destroying the hippocampus. So we see this in large language models. They have that sort of automatic system, but not the conscious system. They are trying to emulate the conscious system with these new chain of thought reasoning approaches, but they're still not conscious. But what this means is that it's really important for us as humans to learn effectively ourselves, because what ChatGPT and other large language models can give us can sometimes be completely imaginary, invented, hallucinated. It is like having this super wonderful assistant that's sometimes a little bit psychopathic. So it's important for us to get that information in our brains. Now, as teachers, we tend to not like ChatGPT because it's pulled the rug out from under us. And I like that picture. I went looking for a picture of the rug being pulled out from under a teacher, and I couldn't find one, so I generated it with generative AI. But the thing is, students don't like to learn. I mean, they do, but they don't. Whenever it gets really tough, it's hard. And research has shown that we sometimes really struggle. It's hard. It's painful for us to try to learn. So students, through thousands of years, have always looked for an easier, kinder, softer way. And it's no surprise that when they have ChatGPT, they'll ask for an answer, think they know think that's it. They've learned how to do it because ChatGPT can do it. But We need to have the information in our own brains. That means what teachers are doing with their traditional approaches and kind of forcing students to learn is still, in fact, it's more important than ever. There's something called the Flynn effect. In this effect, from the 1930s through the 70s, IQ scores around the world went up. Wow, that's pretty cool. And researchers found that, why is that the case? Good educational systems helped people learn more effectively, and that seems to have increased their IQ. But guess what? Since the 1970s, research is showing that IQ scores have been going down. Why? What happened in the 70s? Well, that's when, for example, calculators came out. And suddenly, well-meaning educators and researchers said, you don't need to remember things. You can always just look it up. But remembering is part of that skill of critical thinking. If you get junk from ChatGPT, if you don't have that knowledge in your own brain, you can never think critically about what it's giving you. So when calculators came out, people made the mistake of thinking, you don't need to remember things. You don't need to learn things. We don't want to make that same mistake now that generative AI has come out. It's still important to learn. So I want to give you a bit of a better perspective on, I'm going to focus in now on some of these Western-oriented generative AI engines. There's a lot of tools that are built often out of ChatGPT. So I want to make you aware of a concept called a wrapper. A wrapper, it's not like, you know, the singer on a stage. A wrapper is like a candy wrapper, goes around the candy. And there's a lot of apps that are wrappers that, like, they have as their central sort of engine ChatGPT. Again, because it's the first out of the gate. So for example, there's a lot of writing assistants out there. And, you know, people are familiar with Grammarly. Isn't it funny? I remember 20 years ago or so, Grammarly was coming out and people were so upset because you wouldn't remember how to spell things. Now, nobody worries about whether you can spell things because, hey, we've got Grammarly to help us. Probably you might have seen the newest breakthrough with Notebook LM coming from Google. You can input a research paper and it will give you this cool podcast. I uploaded my book onto, you know, Uncommon Sense Teaching onto Google LM or Notebook LM. And it gave this podcast, like with a man and a woman, and they're going, well, I don't know, what do you think about this? It sounded just like a real podcast conversation, but it got pretty much to the heart of the book. But anyway, so there's these writing assistants. Jasper exemplifies a typical problem in the world of large language models. And that is, we can only pay for so many subscriptions. And so you don't want to pay for a subscription to something that is simply a very easy wrapper around ChatGPT, for example. So Jasper is in trouble now because people have figured out that what it adds is not that much beyond just going to ChatGPT directly. Now, so be aware, some of the things you will purchase will simply be wrappers around some of these large language models. Sometimes they add a lot of value, sometimes they only add a little. So in the world of research, though, there's a lot. These are some of the most popular of the large language models. There's SCITE, S-C-I-T-E. So this one I particularly like. You can watch it. It will go through and it will, like I ask it a research question, it'll go through, give me the results, give me a bunch of citations, then it goes back and it checks the results and the citations. So it's much less likely to confabulate with research. In fact, Semantic Scholar is trained on over 200 million different research papers. So they're often trained differently, and they're much more effective for research. There's live to internet, like Copilot, which is pretty interesting. And if you wait just a minute, I'll get the whole thing up here, and then you can take a picture, because I think it's pretty useful. So Copilot is, I think, quite effective. I personally find that PowerPoint generators are often, they give you a bunch of bullets, they give you some generic pictures, and they all look alike. If you've ever gone to a conference, sometimes I'm like, did you guys all just use the same PowerPoint? You know, it's the same sort of background, the same everything. So I tend to avoid PowerPoint makers, at least at present. There's lots of stuff for teachers and instructors. You can input a lesson plan. You can take pictures of your notes, upload them, and ask it for advice about how to, for example, help your students be more curious about what you're teaching. Curiosity helps enhance the dopamine links of learning. So if you ask for a little advice, it can really help. So there's upskilling. Of course, one of my favorites is Coursera. There's also I Do Recall, which if I have time, I will get to that. Math has Gauth is super popular, partly because you can take a picture of your math homework and it will quite likely give you a solution to it. There's productivity platforms, there's lots of coding, there's imagery of all sorts coming out of ChatGPT and also independently from Midjourney and so forth. There's a lot coming out with video, and this is the big picture if you'd like to take a picture of everything. And it can help you kind of think about how do you think about AI? And this was in part inspired by the book Teaching with AI. And so what I want to do is and also I'm very happy to share these PowerPoint slides. So I think you have them here, and I'll just ask the conference organizers, you can use them. You can, if you're a professor or teacher, you know, just say they're your slides. Show some of them to your students, you know, to help them so they can learn about learning more effectively. But there's a number of books, so I'll just put them all up. Not only Teaching with AI, but Terry Sinowski, my colleague, has, he's written ChatGPT and the Future of AI, which is coming out within a couple of days. Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mullick is a fantastic book. Two of my favorite books are The World I See and The Alignment Problem. And then for worldwide context, AI Superpowers is a great book. So lots of courses on generative AI. There's more, I just released with Jules White, Accelerate Your Learning with ChatGPT. And there's lots of great courses out there. And Nasari, how much time do I have? Oh, okay, wow, okay. So let me ask you this. You are going to have a test now. So I'm going to give you 4 different options. And your goal is to figure out which one, only one, that you would vote for as the best technique for learning. So is it rereading or highlighting, underlining, retrieval practice or recall? That's like using a flashcard or creating a concept map. So now we're going to vote. You get to vote for only one that you think is the best. How many vote for rereading? Nobody, okay? Highlighting, underlining. Okay, we got a few. Retrieval practice, recall. Okay, and creating a concept map. Yeah, so retrieval practice wins. Now, but I know what some of you are thinking. You can always tell people who have been well-trained, they've really tried to do a good job as educators, because we are always taught that concept mapping is the best way for students to learn. But guess what? Nobody ever actually went and checked. And when they finally did check, they found that way better than concept mapping and anything else is using flashcards, using retrieval practice, looking at a page, looking away, and seeing if you can retrieve that information from your own mind. When you're learning something, you are putting weak links in long-term memory. But each time you pull it from your own mind, you are strengthening those links. So this is why retrieval practice is so very important. This has been shown with hundreds and hundreds of studies. So it's invaluable as a technique, and it boggles my mind that educators are not taught this. So I want to give you a little sample of how you can use generative AI to help you with retrieval practice. So, let's see, can we just mute the sound momentarily?
Можна виключити звук, будь ласка? Так, на секунду, щоб було без звуку.
Okay, so if you look, so this is a website called I Do Recall. There's lots of different flashcard systems that are often using generative AI. This is just a sample of one. You can load an electronic document on, and once you've got your document loaded in place, you can tag it. So like this is a document on generative AI, save it. Now, look, you've got your electronic document. Now, what you can do is push that AI button, and what it will do is it will generate a bunch of retrieval practice questions for you. And these aren't just trivial little questions. These are really well organized, often really good, and you can tweak them if there's any problems. You can also just like select a sentence or sentences, and then again, press the AI button, and boom, there you go. It will create these nice flashcards for you. So generative AI is really helping us to create ways where we can still use those traditional techniques like flashcards. And of course, this is saying, what do transformer networks learn to predict? They learn to predict long-range dependencies, and then you can grade yourself. And you can also, with this particular one, I especially like, I do recall, because it links back to the original site that had the materials. So you can even go to like, YouTube online and generate, you can generate all sorts of statistics and so forth. So lots there. Now, let's look. This is a dendrite. I only have like 5 more minutes. 4 more minutes, okay. So I'm gonna go really fast here. So this is a dendrite before learning and before sleep. It's like that leg of the neuron. Look after learning and after sleep. Like, see, look at these 2 dendritic spines. Notice that before learning and before sleep, you didn't have that lower dendrite or dendritic spine wasn't even there. It turns out that sleep is a really important time for the brain to knit together and help make those new connections of learning. So this is why sleep can be so incredibly important. And it's also why we want to space out our learning. So if you have 5 hours in a week, like 1 hour per day over 5 days is way better than 5 hours in 1 day where you're cramming, because you don't have time to strengthen at night. So your little synaptic janitors can more easily sweep things away. So it's like building a brick wall. You know, you lay a layer of bricks and mortar and bricks and mortar, but you take your time, let that mortar dry. If you don't do that, you get a lousy foundation for learning. So I'm going to, one thing I want to say, only 0.13% of educational literature is replicated. It means out of like an entire body of research, that's how much gets checked. Almost nothing. So in the field of education, you can have all these fads come out when people are saying, oh, this is the great new technique for learning. Now, I'm going to have to skip through a bunch of things because there's one thing I really want to show. Oh, too bad. But let's just go back. Notice, in a world, everybody always says student-centered learning is where it's at. But guess what? Would you have figured out all these things I was mentioning today? It turns out that instructors matter too. So both are at play in all of our learning. And I just want to give you a little bit of a sense. Like when, notice, we've got those two different systems. When you are actually actively doing things, that's often using that automatic system. And when you are paying attention, that's the declarative system. But what I really, okay, so just last little point, we're often taught, like, let's say you're learning how to calculate the perimeter versus the area of a circle versus the area of a sphere, something like that. They'll teach you how to calculate the perimeter. You do a bunch of problems. How to calculate the area within the circle. And then maybe, so it's like perimeter, area, volume. But what you really need to do, let's see, this should go, come on, is mix things up in your learning. That can make it stick better. You figure out which tool to use. In other words, do you use the equation for calculating perimeter or for calculating volume or area? But if you learn how to learn, what you can do is stuff like this. So you know what you can do? You can turn the volume back on, and we're going to watch what little Japanese school children can do. This is using a technique called flash anzan. I want you to see if you can add the numbers that you see appearing on the screen. See if you can keep up with these kids. Did you do it? Pretty cool, huh? But I'll show you something even more interesting. Watch this. There's a game called Shiratori. In this game, what you do is there's like different categories of symbols. You have to match, so someone will say a word or whatever symbol that word ends in, the next person has to start the next word with that same category. So, shiritori. Now, what I want you to do is just watch these two little girls laughing as they are playing shiritori while doing flash anzan. So what I just want you to think about is the magic of learning. And if you know a little bit about how your brain learns, and you learn about some of these marvelous new mental tools and old mental tools, you too can do a fantastic job of helping your own life and the lives of those around you to be richer and deeper. So it is with great pleasure that I thank you for the opportunity to share. You are my inspiration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. And we have some time for questions. Yeah, I see hand 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to count how many questions. 7, yeah, okay. Let's start from there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alexandra Baklanova. I want to inquire, Barbara, about your take into how we as educators can help students learn and how students can help themselves when we often are learning now under stress, under severe stress and with trauma. What should we consider? Which factors should we put into our thinking? How can we help our students?
It so happens that the next slide I have talks about exactly that issue. So we used to think you were born with all the neurons you would ever have. And those, and then what would happen would be like, some of these neurons would gradually begin to die off. You'd get older, you'd get dumber, and then you die. And it was so depressing, but fortunately, it was completely wrong. We now understand that new neurons are born every day, especially in the hippocampus, which is, as you know, important for learning and memory. And what these new neurons have is something really magical. They help you learn better, but they also help boost your spirits. They make you feel better. So what those new neurons, look at what they're doing. They're going in and they're like embedding themselves into the lattice. Let's say that you've had trauma. How can you forget that trauma? Guess what? If you can help those new neurons survive, thrive, and grow, they will interject themselves into your long-term memory, those clusters of neurons, and they will disrupt the traumatic memories. So they can help you not only feel better because of the qualities of the new neuron themselves, but also because they're like breaking up traumatic links. How can we help these new neurons survive, thrive, and grow? By learning new things. So for you as teachers, the best thing you can do is focus on getting your students really excited about what you're teaching. What you want to remember is, those new neurons have those special qualities that help you feel better. boost your spirits. And what you want to do is you want to differentiate experiences. So remember how I said that retrieval practice will strengthen memories? Well, what happened when 9/11 happened in the United States? For us, that was a, very big deal. 9,000 therapists descended on New York City after 9/11 to help the people who had suffered trauma using a technique called critical incident stress debriefing. And in this therapy, what you do is you talk to the person as soon as possible after the traumatic event to get everything out of them, right? Wait, does that really make sense? Because if you retrieve an event, you strengthen those memories. In fact, as they found out later, post-traumatic stress syndrome, where you ask people to retrieve these ideas, the really traumatic things, is the worst thing you can do for those who have suffered trauma. Because what is it doing? It's retrieving those memories and it's strengthening them. So if you'll notice, those who survived World War II with really traumatic experiences, they often never talked about it. And there's a reason for that. Talking about it strengthens them. So what you want to do is avoid these kinds of things. You want to put the emphasis, insofar as possible, on new and positive learning. That's going to help, those new neurons to nestle in, interrupt the previous, traumatic memories, and interject new learning that will help boost spirits. In the United States during COVID, they shut down all new learning. Guess what? Depression rates soared. So what teachers are doing, I think they tend to discount the importance of what they're doing with teaching new ideas, new things, being excited about them. That simply doing what you do best in teaching is an awesome thing to help those who have suffered really traumatic experiences.
Thank you. Next question from this side. Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Dima. I'm the student of the first stage of bachelor's program in AI, and you noticed a Pomodoro technique. So in programming and math, there are some kinds of problems that needs to get deep into it for some time to create some complex solution, some really complex problems. So how to use Pomodoro technique in these cases, and is it okay to use Pomodoro technique in these cases? Thank you.
What a great question. And what that allows me to also bring out is the idea that 25-minute limit, that's like a best guess. And it's not this hard and fast rule that you've always only got to do 25 minutes. So given whatever you're working on, sometimes it will make sense to focus, perhaps far more extensively. I will say that I know a world-class concert pianist, and she used to practice for 3 hours straight, just always she was really focused on that. But she did find that when she took these little breaks, her learning actually progressed more swiftly. So I'd say experiment a little bit. Sometimes, take a little break, but don't go focusing on anything else. Let your mind kind of just let those ideas you've just been working with reverberate around in your brain. But you are absolutely correct. There's no hard and fast rule, but explore some of these little breaks. And if you have trouble with motivating yourself, a Pomodoro of 25 minutes can be a great way to get started.
Thank you.
Good question.
Yep.
What do you think about potential involving of robotics in teaching? Maybe for acquiring of knowledge of teacher for future learning?
So the question of robotics is an interesting one. In China, it is being incorporated in some rural areas out in the countryside where they're finding it difficult to get good teachers, and they're actually getting quite good results with it. So there's a recent paper in the last year or so in Science about active learning in a STEM classroom. And this paper re-emphasized, oh, you've got to be doing everything actively. But the problem is, what they were saying was, it's all active learning means the student is doing something. But, teachers do matter as well. And as it turns out, in that science paper, what they were doing was they were tutoring with little robots, but they weren't calling that teaching. And it is teaching. So I think in the future, especially for younger students, watching people's faces and not on a flat screen is really important in those early years of learning. As they grow older, perhaps robots, certainly there's lots of evidence that people can learn very effectively online, as long as they're motivated. So motivation can happen in many different ways. And one of the ways is by the enthusiasm of the instructor. If you're going through a camera, you lose about 10 charisma points just for going through the camera, which is why it's so important to be like over the top when you're teaching online. I don't think the answer is really clear to us yet. Robots could be helpful, but I think it's going to be a long time coming. Fei-Fei Li, who I alluded to at the very beginning of this talk, is doing very interesting work. We have large language models, but what she's now working to help create are robots, in a sense, that learn how to perceive things just in the way that humans learn how to perceive things. So I suspect growing from her and her colleagues' research and those of many others in this area, we're going to have some pretty incredible robots in the future that will be able to do things we can barely imagine now. Really interesting area, an interesting question.
Another AI student, yeah?
Thank you, Barbara, for coming to Ukraine, for giving us such interesting information, some stories. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. And, I think, in my humble opinion, our educational system is now struggling a little. We have some crises like COVID, and now we are in war. And that causes a lot of problems in some regions, and in general in Ukraine. We have a lot of online systems of online formats of education and simplified exams. So our educational system is struggling. And I'm really concerned about this. I really want to fix this somehow. I wonder if you know some very cool practices, maybe from some different countries that can fix this problem. I think that we can implement something like similar to Khan Academy, platform resource to enhance the interest of our students in schools to learn by themselves, just to improve this interested in learning. So I really wonder to hear your opinion and what can you tell us for this? Thank you.
That's a very perceptive question that gets right to the future of Ukraine. My best sort of idea that I can put forth is begin to teach students how to learn effectively. So for example, there's a high school in Qatar, and what they do is they teach about linking neurons, about the Pomodoro technique, about all of these, some of these learning techniques, and they do it in high school. And there's a elementary school in Michigan where they teach about these ideas in 1st through 5th grade. So if you could have some simple videos available to help teachers learn about these ideas that can also be used to help students learn about these ideas. It's kind of scary if you're not well versed in the neuroscience literature. You can say, oh, well, I can't teach these things. But a simple little 5-minute video dubbed in Ukrainian, which there are available. They took our Learning How to Learn course and put it on the platform, Ukrainian platform Prometheus. And there's great videos in Ukrainian that could be used throughout the schools, the K-12 schools here in Ukraine. Teach students how to learn. And I think you will see the results very quickly. You want to just not give fish to people. You teach them how to fish. In the same way, you want to teach them how to learn. That's what's going to make these independent learners, more easily.
Thank you. Here, please.
Hello, thank you for coming in Ukraine. I have one pretty short but practical question. I'm a student here in Kyiv School of Economics, master's degrees, and I always had problem with note-taking during lectures. When I'm trying to focus on lecture, I can't focus to make notes because I am losing focus of context. And I had this struggle for many years, many educations, and I want to hear your point about it. Does it important to take notes during lecture?
That's a really good question because
Relieve me, please.
I struggled with the same thing when I was a student. If there's a way to get a video recording of that professor, you could load it onto Gemini, ask it to create really good notes for you, and then you could pay attention. There is good research that shows that if you don't have a big working memory, and I don't have, like Terry Sanowski, my colleague, he can hold like 15 things in mind at once. Well, I'm lucky to hold 3 in mind, So note-taking was always a struggle for me because I could either take notes and not understand, or I could kind of follow what was going on but not take notes. So research has shown that if you borrow the notes from someone else who has taken those notes, you will actually do quite nicely. So it's not that you necessarily need to write it out by hand yourself, but that tells me that if we can load the video onto ChatGPT or Gemini and ask it to come up with a nice set of notes from us watching this good teacher and also come up with retrieval practice questions for us, that is the best of all worlds, I think.
Thank
But
you.
we struggled with the same thing.
Yeah, please.
My name is Natalia Zyka, Institute for Behavioral Studies at American University, Kyiv. Many thanks for this great lecture and for your time here. My question is the following. My 12-year-old son used to ask me, why should I remember so many things at school? Why should I memorize them? You know, when Kyiv was established, what the cube volume formula is. I can Google it in a second. You touch a little bit on that, but I would like you to expand. So if you were now in the audience of, 10, 12-year-old kids asking you, why should we remember so many things at school if this information is available all around in a couple of clicks? So what would be your answer to them?
That you need to have that information in mind to help you build new knowledge and think critically about what generative AI is giving you. If you give that answer, they will not believe you. They'll say, oh, well, so what? But I will give you an example of what I mean. In the US, it became popular not to teach, for example, dates of history. Oh, dates of history, that's dry and boring, and students don't need to know that stuff. So as a consequence, what happened was, so in the 1860s, we had our Civil War. And in the 1960s, we had the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King. So we had the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln, and 100 years later, we had the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King. Because students did not memorize the dates, if you asked them about the Civil War, they would confuse it with civil rights, and they would often think that Abraham Lincoln must have known Martin Luther King, and they hung out together. So getting those facts in memory, actually, without that, they begin to lose the context of their history. And you, in Ukraine, do not want to lose the context of your extraordinary history. So with my younger daughter, I was like, have you ever heard of the concept of a tiger mom? Where it's often thought of as mothers from China who want their children to know about dance and know about how to do a sport, know about, extra practice with all sorts of different things. So they don't have a lot of spare time, but they end up, with a lot of skills and knowledge. Well, I personally am too lazy to be a tiger mom. And so what I decided was I would be a tiger mom with our two daughters with only one paw. That meant I got to choose one thing, and I insisted on that one thing. And that one thing was I had them do an extra 20 minutes a day of practice with mathematics using a very cleverly designed program called Kumon Mathematics. And that was designed by a mathematician in Japan for his son, who was doing terribly in math at school. So I had our daughters doing this little bit of extra practice for over a decade. They started when they were 3 with a little extra practice with math, and then went all the way through into their teens. And our older daughter was like, she was never very good at math anyway. So, this extra practice really helped her. And she became, quite good with math. And she ended up getting into medical school and doing her medical residency at Stanford. So I'm very proud of her because she would have been one of those little girls that's like, I can't do math. But our younger daughter, she was the artist. She didn't like math at all. So that meant for 10 years, every 20 minutes a day, was a fight, a struggle with her. You know, because it was like, no, I don't want to do it. I hate math. I don't want to. So she's an artist. She went to college, got her degree in art, went out in the working world and found out that it's really tough to make it as an artist. She didn't make much money, and she wasn't very satisfied with the kinds of things she was doing. So she went back and got her graduate degree, her master's in statistics. And I met the son of her research advisor who she wrote papers with when I was in Vietnam. And his son said, Barb, I just don't understand. My father usually never takes students who've gone through the American school system because they just don't have a feel for the numbers. What was different about your daughter? And I was like, 10 freaking years of extra, 20 minutes a day. So, if it's a struggle to make them get the facts, just do it. It's a little bit of, that's the key, is just do a little bit every day over a number of days, even if they don't quite get, because no matter how you explain it, they don't want to do it. So they're going to find a way to kind of rebut whatever you explain. So you can just say, it's because I'm a mom, and this is what you need to do. And it's perfectly okay for short periods to insist on some things that they do need to know. Very good question.
Thank you. This half? No? Please.
I am glad to see you very much. I have a question very similar to previous one because I have changed my major. I decided to study a new program. I am studying economics master. I used to be a Bachelor of Political Science, but now I really struggle with math. I struggle with economics because I imagine economics to be so fun social science about behavior, about going to the shop, buying products, bargaining for the price. But now I see the reality of models, reality of samples. I see wave of algebra. And I really struggle right now because I didn't study math for 4 years. I had a class in logics, but logics is not math. I studied math last time 4 years ago, maybe even longer, seriously, because I am decided to focus on humanities. But right now, I really need to look in and change my fate, change my destiny. And I didn't have those 20 minutes every day, but I need something like this right now. What would you advise for me to cling on my state of things?
So remember that, like for Ramoni Cajal, when he was older, he was switching, and he so regretted that he hadn't learned math as a youngster. And for me, I didn't learn math as a youngster. So the main thing is to don't be, what I want you to be is humble. Admit wherever you are, what level you are, and then start no matter how low that level is, just start there and give yourself extra time. So let's say you're taking an economics class, and you're taking these classes, and and it's really hard because it has some mathematical theory. Don't take, if the typical recommendation is 4 classes in a semester, take 3. So you have more time to catch back up on what you're studying. And then as you're trying to learn these things, go back and try to get that fundamental math, while you're still trying to keep up with the classes. Give yourself more time, and you will find you learn it more deeply. There'll be people who can learn it really fast, and they will end up coming to you because you've struggled with it, and you will understand it in a very deep way. So if you're a slower learner, that's okay. Just give yourself the time and be like Ramoni Cajal, be persistent.
Thank you. This part, yeah, question there. Raise the hand in order to see you.
Hi, I'm Eve. Thank you for coming here. So I have a question for you. I had experience, without big intro, on classes of IT school for kids. You can imagine, it was like wider, not in depth. I heard a topic about like quote about which I was really puzzled. Since we have cool presentations and we don't dive deep into topics, or we don't really need teachers. We just can, well, one mentor you can ask, but mostly there is no need for our teachers to really know the material. And I was really questioned about that because from the school it wasn't like that. So I have a question for you. Do you think that, so basically if you don't have a teacher you can ask ChatGPT or something like that, do you think that this connection of person to person is that important in learning, is crucial for having at least some experience, that maybe something in it changes the way you learn? I can feel it, but I cannot put my finger on why. Maybe you can answer.
Let's say that all those PowerPoints I just showed, let's say that you didn't see me here, you only heard my voice. Would you have paid as much attention? Probably not. My physical presence helps. When you see me moving, when you see how I'm teaching you to grasp these ideas, as I was just saying, grasp and moving my hands, your mirror neurons were firing, and your hand, even though it wasn't moving, the neurons were similarly firing, and that helped you understand what I was saying. So can you get that from an online presentation? Yes, if the student is older and if they're motivated. But if you're not motivated, when you see me being really excited about what I'm talking about, your mirror neurons, you can't help it. Like, okay, here's what I would do in my classes. I was assigned to teach introductory electrical engineering to a class that was half electrical engineers and half mechanical engineers. Mechanical engineers are rather notorious for hating electrical engineering ideas. It's all these, fuzzy circuits. You can't get your hands on the pumps and things like that. So the mechanical engineers would always sit in the back, and they would be completely unmotivated. And what I did was, my personal challenge was to make all those mechanical engineering students in the back so excited about learning electrical engineering that they would switch majors. That was my challenge to myself. Do you know, I got in trouble with the mechanical engineering department because so many students were switching their majors into electrical engineering. So that passion, it's the expectation of the teacher, the passion of the teacher, the excitement and the enthusiasm. Even if you have really unmotivated students, you can change how they're thinking. So I think teachers are really important. Online, you can teach, but you can teach to those who are already motivated. In person, you can help motivate.
Hi, I'm a bit of a scientist myself, and I teach as well. And I was thinking about this Flynn chart, about Flynn effect, and I'm kind of thinking that before 70s, life was a bit easier. We kind of envy of our grandparents that their history was shorter, right? And since then, we have this development of computers and lots of information, and probably over the last 10, 15 years, the world produced more PhDs than 100 years before. And they collectively generated, thanks to generative AI, thousands more papers than the world before. And now we basically overwhelmed in the information. And probably those IQ tests, they do not very much test how much we deal with this new information. They just check pretty much old ways how we think, but they do not test what the new ways how we think. They do not test how we filter the information, how we try to see what we need. They do not, and we have to deal with all the information. So the question is not only how to study more efficiently, the question is how to get through all this information to get only what you need the most right now, because I think this is one of the biggest challenges for most students who study, because they have so much information around them that it is very difficult to tell them that this particular integral or this particular theory is so much important compared to the 100 new TikToks that they see on their screen as well. So there is like competition here, and the question is how to persuade them that this is kind of more important rather than just procrastinating immediately. So this is, I'm just trying to understand what's your view on this information overload.
That is a very perceptive observation on what's going on in society today. And again, I have to return to the idea of teaching students how to learn, and you can do that by teaching them how their brain works. We are limited with those 4 arms of the octopus. You know, we can only take in a little bit of information at a time. So I didn't talk about multitasking, but often students they'll know somebody who's able to listen to the radio, read, and address a conversation at the same time. And they're like, I'm going to multitask just like them, and I will be more efficient when in my studies. And also this idea of, you know, attention flickering back and forth. You know, you get a TikTok, flick to the new TikTok, and so forth. And the reality is that, you know, we can only grasp a limited amount of information at a time. For 98% of people, it helps to put aside, do like a 25-minute Pomodoro, and that will help you focus more effectively and be more effective in your work. Your working memory can only handle so much information unless you are amongst the 2% of the population that is what is called a supertasker. A supertasker really can switch attention from here to here to here and actually absorb information from several sources at once. So like 1 in 50 people you know is a supertasker. And supertaskers are wonderful as emergency room physicians. Think about it, you know, you got someone right there in critical situation in front of you, but you've got to also be aware of what's going on with some of the mechanical devices, and where's the nurse who's going to be doing this task. You have to be aware of a lot of things at once. So supertaskers are great as emergency room doctors, race car drivers, world-class chefs. But if my mother had cancer, I don't want her to go to a doctor who's a supertasker. I want her to go to a doctor who can really focus in deeply. But getting back to your question, the thing is, for most students, if we teach them that it is better to focus, put aside all distractions, do a Pomodoro, it can actually teach them to return to being able to focus more effectively. If your attention's always scattered, you think, oh, we've lost that generation. But actually, the human brain is very flexible. You can reteach yourself how to maintain focus longer simply through practicing Pomodoro techniques. And so I think teaching students how the brain works, why it's valuable to avoid, when they're trying to study, avoid flickering back and forth for 98% of students. The one interesting fact is the worse a student is at, in other words, they do worse when they're multitasking. Those are the ones who think they're best at multitasking. And the ones who are best at multitasking don't do it most of the time. So it's a bit of a long-winded way of circling around your question, but I think it really goes down to teach students how their brain works, that they only have a limited working memory capacity. They really need to focus when they are learning something. Practice extending that focus without being distracted by TikTok or whatever. Just do it for 25 minutes, and it will teach them. Do you know that young Chinese, and I'm not recommending this, but like a first grader, they will teach a first grader in China to focus on a spot on the wall for a minute. And for a little kid, a minute is really a long time. They actually teach how to focus and how to kind of extend that focus. And we can teach teenagers and adults how to get that focus back even after COVID and in this era of TikTok by teaching them techniques like the Pomodoro technique.
Юра.
Thank you for your speech. I am Yuri, and I am a math teacher at KC University, and also I'm a PhD student in mathematics. And I already for 6 years as a math teacher, and I see some problems from perspective from students. And here we can speak from sides like focus mode and another type of
diffuse mode.
Diffuse mode, yes, thank you. And so when students take tests, they are focusing on algorithms and other stuff, rules, etc., to work on questions. And so I think that their diffuse mode isn't working on tests as good as focus mode. And it's also about practice, of course. We need to practice a lot to get better in algorithms. But on the other side, if student get a new equation that he or she doesn't work earlier, but he already has tools to work on this equation. But he needs just some creativity tools. So what would you recommend for students to become more creative in using and working with math is first question. Another question is
wait, I have a limited working memory, so let me try to address that question. I skipped over a video where my colleague Terry Sinowski is talking about a very advanced physicist, Michael Nielsen, who was trying to understand a new theory with a proof for how to prove this theorem. And so what he did was he used retrieval practice. He would go for walks and he would try to retrieve the steps of the theorem, but also really understand them while he was, and after a while he could manipulate aspects of this equation, kind of like a Rubik's Cube in his mind. And by retrieving it, he actually came up with a new proof for the problem that was better and simpler than the previous proof. So teaching students to think about math by retrieving key ideas, that can be valuable. But when it comes to testing, there's something that we're often told, start with the easiest problem first. Have you heard that when you're taking a test, start with that'll build your confidence. Now, if you have not studied it all, that's the best approach to take. Just do whatever easy ones you can. But if you studied for this test, your best approach is to scan the test quickly and then pull to mind, like pick out the hardest question on that test. Start working on that problem. Within maybe 2 minutes, you'll get stuck. When you get stuck, transfer your attention to a much easier problem and work on that. What it will do, when I was teaching about focused versus diffuse mode, I said, you cannot be in both modes at the same time on the same topic. So when you switch your focus to another problem, your diffuse mode can be working in the background on that first difficult problem. Now, if you wait until the end of the test to do the hardest problem, it's like, that's the end of the test. It's the time when you have very little time, it's really stressful. It's the worst time to work on the hardest problem. But if you preloaded that problem in your mind, your diffuse mode is working in the background as you're working on the other problems. Then you return to that problem, and you already will find that you have ideas about how to solve it. So that's a way of like using both modes in the same at the same time, but they're just not focusing on the same things at the same time. And you can be more creative in that way on tests. So retrieval, so that's what I call the hard start, jump to easy technique. And then also remember, for creativity in general, kind of retrieving the information, practicing with it, really getting it down inside you, and playing with it in your own mind, not just looking at it on a page. All of those links of learning can be recombined in novel ways, when you happen to be in the diffuse mode, taking a shower, going out for a walk, or famously, Poincaré solved his most difficult problem when he was stepping off a bus. So they often say bed, bath, and bus are the places where most creativity takes place. So you need to have those links of learning, but then also those times of relaxation where the creativity can come together.
Yes, so thank you for the answer. And the next answer will be that, for example, we teach students some math tools in one course or in several courses, but in some time students need to use these instruments on economics or programming or etc. But actually they already learned it earlier, but now they stuck with that and they just do some unlogic ways of solving economic problems or etc. What would you recommend to to using mathematical tools in other subjects?
That's a good question. I think that the best way to really tackle that is Freeman Dyson, for example, was Einstein's mathematician. When Einstein would get stuck with things, he would work with Freeman Dyson. And Dyson, what he would do was similar to what Richard Feynman would do. He worked lots and lots and lots of problems. Dyson would go take Christmas break and work lots of problems. So the best way to kind of tackle the idea of using equations in different fields is to just do it. Practice working with it. And I don't think there's a magic, easier tool than simply trying equations and learning how they can be used. Perhaps one way to address it, though, is with ChatGPT, and just as you're learning a mathematical equation, just ask it, What other field can I use this in? Can you give me a practical example of this? Can you give me a question that would allow me to use this equation within this other field? I always used to get really annoyed because when I was learning, trying to retrain my brain in engineering, I wanted lots and lots of problems. I knew that it was similar to learning a language. Learning a language often means practicing a lot. Well, teachers, the professors, they'd come up with their tests, they'd have their homework problems, but they wouldn't give you extra problems. They would like, even tests, they'd say, well, you figure it out. See, I'll mark it wrong, but I won't tell you why it's wrong. And it was very frustrating for me because I couldn't get lots of extra practice problems, which I knew would be very important. Nowadays, that's one of the great things about ChatGPT. It can give you lots and lots of extra practice problems. And using interfaces, for example, with Wolfram Alpha and so forth, it can actually give you really good mathematical results. And so I think that's one of the great things, and perhaps ChatGPT and other large language models could be helpful in this situation as well.
Thank you. And I will allow a question for myself. Last one. Yeah? Last one. So I have a daughter. She's a second grader. And I'm actually at risk of being bad father for not buying a smartphone for her. And
Bill Gates did not give his daughter a smartphone until she was 14.
Yeah,
you are
but
being like Bill Gates.
And we are like a minority in our class. So everybody else already has a smartphone. And my daughter is often found herself being bored. So I'm bored, and I'm happy with that. So because I recall myself being bored, and that was like a wonderful time of, eureka for some, I don't know, new facts, interesting facts. But it seems I won't last long anymore. And since we have a mother also in a combination, we are almost like buying the smartphone. And the question is, what is a scientific approach here about gadgets and gadget with social medias and different apps for kids? Because it seems like all countries, they are like lagging behind with this matter, like only like starting to think whether we need to ban something or to do something else with that. Because it's like seems like a pandemic of this distraction. Because you always repeat this, like put aside a distraction and concentrate. But what if there is no any like possibility to put aside a distraction? Because this distraction is like give you so much dopamine.
Oh yeah. Well, you're asking a question at the heart, I think, of most parenting situations today. And there is a really good course on Coursera by Jules White, and it's for parents to teach them how to teach generative AI to their children, or if you're a teacher, to teach how to use generative AI to your students. And one little thing that he did in this course, which I thought was interesting, was he said, well, I was sitting and having coffee one morning, and my son came down and asked me if I would unlock the iPad so he could have a little time on the iPad. That tells you right there. Use something to limit the amount of time that your children spend online. There are actually boxes you can buy that you can put an iPhone in and lock it so that people can't get jail for iPhones. And so that was a good thing. But he went on to say that his son came downstairs and he was realizing that he was all out of his cup of coffee and he was going to make another one, but he said, he asked his son, he said, well, would you make me a cup of coffee? And if you do, I'll unlock your iPad. And his son says, I don't know how to make coffee. So Jules thinks, teachable moment. So he says, okay, go take a picture of the coffee machine and put it on ChatGPT and ask it to tell you how to make coffee. So he did. He took a picture and he learned from ChatGPT how to, step by step, and his dad helped him, of course. But he also learned how to learn, at least in this context, through ChatGPT. So what I think we can take away from this is, number one, it can be valuable to have locks on your devices and only limit the amount of time. I would check on ChatGPT, on Claude, on Gemini, say, what do you recommend as the limits that I should have for my children? I would also highly recommend the latest book by Jonathan Haidt on the dangers of social media. So read that book and it will give you some good ideas about, what's dangerous, how much they should have, especially for women that are in their teenage years. That peer pressure can be so horrible, and there can be bullying that occurs and all this kind of thing. So keep a careful watch on what your daughter is doing. Limit the time, and then read a little bit more about it.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I got signals that we are running out of time, so we will finish at this moment, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.